Number of things I want to remind you, but first I really want to welcome you. There are so many of us gathered here this evening. There's literally 100 people from all over the world. We've already heard from Israel, from the United States, from France, and I'm sure many more. What I'd like to say is that these activities are, of course, in this time of lockdown, they've been open to everyone and their friends and their families and so on. But we are very much encouraging those who've come to join us as members, which would mean not only a continued menu of activities such as this, also our fantastic annual publication in Jewish history, which is really just totally excellent, and access to a lot of information and material that we really have opened up to all during lockdown, but which will become, I think, the privilege of members as we go forward. So we need your help. Why do we need your help? Well, in the most immediately, we needed to pay the Zoom subscription because the numbers are so great and we want to have long periods of Zoom. So we obviously have to pay for that. But we do a whole lot of other great things. We give awards to local communities engaged in Jewish history. We support young researchers. Everything is done with the utmost of scrutiny, and every penny is used to a good end and is discussed and debated through the various committees of the executive committee. So I just want to encourage you, if you're not already a member, to consider becoming one. It's extremely easy on our website, and if you have any questions, you can write to me or to Caroline Morris or Ian Cobden, the various people on the list who are also named on our website. I also have to say, before we move on to the joyous lecture, that is joyous in terms of whenever you're learning something new, it's joyous. But before we move on to that part of the evening, this is, as David Jacobs just mentioned, also a very sad day for the society and for all those who knew Ada Rappaport Albert. Ada was a president of the society. David said to me today, it was just always a pleasure to work with her, which doesn't surprise me one bit. She was the most extraordinary scholar, particularly of the Hasidic movement and the role of women within it. But she was a true polymath. She was born in Tel Aviv. She died this morning in London, surrounded by her children and grandchild and close friends. She was the most gracious, beautiful, inspiring person. That is the case, and the society will find ways of remembering and celebrating her when it's appropriate, I'm sure, and you will find out about it. But I know some members of the society were really close friends and are truly bereaved today. So I just wanted to mention that Ada Rappaport Albert, Yehi Zichra Baruch. And I know that I don't know, Sarah, if you ever met Ada in your many visits to Britain. She would have just loved your work. She was interested way beyond just the period that she studied, but she also took the long view. She was interested in medieval materials. I just recently, she was so generous, although she was ill, she was so generous. She, in November, examined the PhD of the doctorate of one of my PhD students, Magdalena Janosikova, and the care with which she commented upon this piece of work, and even afterwards writing to Magdalena, and when she was really ill. So, well, that's the measure of the woman, and we will remember her. I just thought I wanted to mention this, but that doesn't mean that we will not move on and enjoy our time together as we learn. I say enjoy, this is serious stuff. But whenever we learn, as I said, whenever we're together in Chevruta, all learning together, there's a particular joy in that. So it's such a pleasure to just share with you, as it were, the learning and the grace of my friend Sara Lipton, who many of you know, have met because she's a regular visitor to Britain through her association through a visiting fellow in Oxford on several occasions, and in London, even at Queen Mary. She visits regularly. Indeed, she was going to deliver this lecture to us, as it were, face to face. But actually, Sara, due to the circumstances, I think probably a larger number of people will now hear you and see you. So that is something to be celebrated. She is the world expert on how the visual image of the Jew that we know, that we see around us still, how it was born, what it meant for the Jews of Europe, that people represented them in a particular way, that they could go around and see art that showed them with the crooked nose, with the hirsute face, with the sort of menacing attitude, etc. And she's done this work in a very sensitive fashion, and also, as you will see, has taken it beyond just the effect on Jewish people. I just want to raise, you'll be able to obviously find out all about her from her website, but just to raise, so you see her two extraordinary books, which are always literally on my desk. Both of them deal with visual representation as a historical phenomenon that we need to understand. So she literally speaks for herself, her learning, her grace, her good sense, and I'll let her begin, and we will have questions afterwards. And I know we will all come away better informed and better people for it. So over to you, Sara, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mary. Could I just see also, Mary, nod if you can hear me well enough?
Sure, that's great.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful for the invitation. The Jewish Historical Society of England has been important to me ever since I was an undergraduate, and I think probably one of the very first articles on medieval visuals that I read was by your past president, Sir Cecil Roth, who was the first person to publish just one or two of the images I'll be showing you. And as Mary mentioned, my heart is very much split between New York and England, and shout out to Paris as well, where I have spent many, many happy months and in fact several years. So today I'm going to speak about my research in the Middle Ages and then bring what that research has taught me about understanding more contemporary images. Pardons for the siren, I'm in Manhattan where those sounds are all too common. I should say that I'm obviously not a historian of English politics or of contemporary English political debate. So really all I'm trying to do is, again, maybe help you read the images that you see around you in the newspaper still in light of their very, very long prehistory. So let me just start by looking at the definitions and the functions of caricature and political cartoon. Oh, and I have to move this clearly. The definition of a caricature from the Oxford English Dictionary, my go-to place for all definitions, is a grotesque or ludicrous representation of persons or things by exaggeration of their most characteristic and striking features. So one of the interesting and really paradoxical things about caricatures is they are both true and not true, meaning the features have to be somehow characteristic, if not real, at least real in people's minds, or so firmly associated with those people or groups that they seem to have some truth to them. They have to be noticeable, striking, but the exaggeration, the grotesqueness, the ludicrousness means that in fact there is a largely untrue part. They're so exaggerated. And what is a political cartoon? It's defined as a drawing that uses simplified imagery in some way, it's schematic in some way, featuring readily recognizable symbols and satire. Satire is very much a feature of the political cartoon, it's not documentation, in order to comment on politics or current events. So, how do caricatures and cartoons work? Building on those simple definitions, it's important to understand that both caricatures and political cartoons are designed in some way to unmask, meaning to highlight or to reveal hidden or unseen qualities. They require just a very short processing time. You can look quickly at a one square cartoon, look quickly at a political cartoon or a caricature, so they have a very immediate impact. And that impact tends to activate the emotions. It is affective, as we call it, rather than kind of analytical. They tend to be either overtly or latently hostile or aggressive, although the hostility is often denied with the caricaturist or the publisher claiming that the humor was just a joke. And that is one way to diffuse criticism. Now, obviously, sometimes cartoons are funny, but often, especially in the political context, the funniness is very much kind of a mechanism for aggression, hostility, or criticism. What is the effect when you combine caricature with its distortion and cartoon with its satirical kind of unmasking latent hostility? Too often, not inevitably, but too often the effect is to encourage stereotyping, meaning that such things allow for the expression of prejudice by people who otherwise would not feel comfortable of more overtly expressing prejudice. Frequently, the distortions in caricature or political cartoon come to be accepted as real, meaning if not completely realistic, at least getting at some kind of hidden reality. And then finally, as I'll be showing towards the end of this talk, themes and images from one established caricature can be transferred from the group to which it was first applied to another, thereby creating new prejudices. So let me just quickly look at one of those famous kind of schematic illustrations of how caricatures develop. This is a caricature by the 19th century French caricaturist, political cartoonist Honoré Daumier. It's called Les Poires, the pears. He was actually arrested and put in trial and eventually jailed for caricatures featuring this representation of the then King of France, Louis Philippe. And his defense of these kinds of caricatures in which he showed Louis Philippe as a pear said, I can't help it if the king looks like a pear. I only draw what I see and what the king looks like. But of course, it takes a caricaturist to show people or to convince people that this rather, normal looking head suddenly can be seen as a pear. So it was a very disingenuous defense on Daumier's part. And as the king well understood, it's the whole reason he threw Daumier in jail. This kind of satire can have real world impacts. It can make the king look ridiculous. It can therefore kind of loosen criticism. And as Louis Philippe feared, perhaps even rebellion, which of course did end up happening to Louis Philippe. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the development of the anti-Jewish caricature. I hope that's not bad news to the audience, but I have published about that extensively and spoken about that many times, and I didn't want to repeat myself for those of you who have heard me speak before. Is that someone speaking to me? Okay, but very, very quickly, I just wanted to put this slide up. It's a slide from an illuminated manuscript dating to about the year 980 to show you that for really the first 1,000 years of Christianity and of post-Roman Western art, and this is true of pre-Roman Western art as well, Jews were not recognizable by these features or these symbols in art in any way. So that you have here these pontifices, these priests are supposed to be Jewish priests, and in face and hairstyle, in every other way, they are not distinguishable from the milites, that means Roman non-Jewish soldiers kneeling below them. So in other words, the Jewish caricature is not a constant in Western history. It had to be invented at a certain time and place. By perhaps 100 years after I showed you that previous image, artists just were starting to develop some recognizable signs for hats, but they are not yet caricatures. This is an illustration from a manuscript that's firmly dated to the year 1084, and this Hebrew prophet can be identified by his pointed hat, which is actually based on the ancient hats of Persian, Near Eastern, priests and potentates. It has nothing Jewish about it. It's not what Jews wore at the time. Jews were often, but not always, shown with beards. Again, not because Jews at the time always wore beards at all, but more to signal that they were a sign of antiquity and maybe outdated. And by the scroll form, old-fashioned versions of the book. It's not clear how many viewers of this, Christian viewers of this manuscript, would have thought about a Torah scroll when they looked at this scroll. So this is all the sort of before the caricature period, which lasted all the way until really the 1200s. After about 1240, as you will see, there did begin to be very clearly recognizable, if not inevitable and unchanging, symbols and facial features associated with Jews. Here is a list of the most common physical features, and this will be familiar to you from more modern images as well as from medieval images: a bent or a hooked nose, a pointed hat, which morphed sometimes into a hood or an Eastern style turban of some kind, heavy dark eyebrows, bulging, staring or shifty eyes, full lips, especially one with a protruding lower lip, a beard, a goatee, or a jutting chin of some kind, and a grimace, the bare teeth here, or the frown that we see over here. There are also kind of non-physical attributes that were frequently shown together with Jews as symbols that helped them be identified as Jews. Money coins, as we see right here, the bag of sovereigns, a foreign dialect or accent up here. Poigot, our peoples have got Odimonish, that's a caricature of a Yiddish accent. Tablets of the law, this was the identifying badge imposed on Jews in England after 1218. A devil or a demon, we'll see those coming up. A sign or a gesture of deceit, this is kind of touching your nose and shifting your eyes to the right, or both gestures of deceit. And then some kind of indication that Jews are associated with blood, with violence, with murder. Okay, so now I'm really going to start looking more closely at what other people have argued, and I have argued at considerable length in a few places, can probably be considered the earliest English political cartoon. I will probably be going through this very complex image too fast, so I will tell you all that if you just Google Isaac and Antichrist then and now and my name, you can find a written version of this on the web, on a blog. So this is it. This is a doodle. It's very small. It's probably only about 6 inches wide, in fact. At the top of a revenue receipt roll from the exchequer of the Jews from Easter term 1233. And this is often known as the Isaac of Norwich cartoon, because this 3-headed figure up here is labeled with these words, Isaac of Norwich. Here are various figures whose symbols I'm going to be examining in somewhat closer detail, although again, I'm by no means saying everything that can be said about them. Let us start with Isaac himself. So up here is where it says Isaac de Norwich in French. What do we see here? He's given 3 faces, which medieval people would have associated with the Antichrist, for reasons I'll show you in a second, and therefore is labeling Isaac either devilish or deceitful in some way. The crown is a symbol of power, and probably because associated with gold, associated with money. And remember, of course, this is a receipt roll from the exchequer, the financial office of the king. And so that too gives the context, the overall concern about money. He, of course, has the pointed beard. He has a kind of grimace, maybe the teeth showing here, maybe a frown here. He has dark, heavy eyebrows. The nose, I'm not sure about. Maybe it's slightly sloping, maybe it's slightly bulbous, or maybe it's actually not a particularly exaggerated nose. I don't like to impose expectations on images. And a foreign dialect or accent, maybe, insofar as he's given his name in French, Isaac de Norwich. That is because the Jews of England in this time would have been primarily speakers of Anglo-Norman, the English dialect of French. On the other hand, would that have made him foreign in this context? Perhaps not, because the language of the court at this time was also French. So that is also perhaps a question mark, but since it does become a powerful theme later, I thought I would suggest it as a possible resonance of this image for the viewers. Here is an image showing why I say the three faces would definitely have been associated with the Antichrist. This is a more or less contemporary manuscript made in Paris in the year 1225, illustrating a text that says that Jews and heretics and all bad people take Antichrist to be their Lord. And this is how that artist decided to show Antichrist with three faces being crowned, very similar to the image of Isaac of Norwich, of course. And again, we see here he's associated with Jews and with money, because they are taking Antichrist to be their Lord in that they are paying him tribute in the form of a money bag. However, I should warn that one of my fundamental arguments in almost all of my work is just because an image has Jewish signals, resonates with Jewish associations, does not inevitably mean that it's anti-Jewish. And just to make that point, with the help of my good friend Stuart Brooks, who I hope is with us, he said he was going to join us, I wanted to show you three Hebrew manuscripts that also use three-faced creatures, just as kind of marginal doodles, perhaps without much in the way of meaning. And I cannot tell you what they mean, but I put them up here to show that maybe three faces were not always seen as anti-Jewish, at least by medieval Jews. On the other hand, maybe they're taking images they associate with anti-Judaism and subverting them in their own way. Two other figures who are both identified as Jews are this man here. He's labeled Mosa Mocha, that is Moses Mocha. He's a figure about whom we know a fair amount because he appears in archival records. This is a woman who is labeled Avegai, that's the Hebrew for Abigail. There are many Abigails in the contemporary records, and we do not know which, if any, ones these are. But they are clearly both Jewish people. They are associated with the devils or the demon in that they're on either side of this devilish figure who is touching their noses or tweaking their noses in some way. And I believe that he's tweaking them in part to highlight the similarity between their overly long noses and his own. He is given a long kind of beaked nose as well. They are associated with deceit. That is also perhaps a stretch, but they are both shown in a kind of courtly attire. This headdress is a very courtly headdress. She has sort of long coiled, and it looks like blondish hair, which would have been a very courtly kind of hairstyle, and obviously the preferred hair coloring in England, where blonde was considered the fairest, pun intended, of hair colors. This man, Moses, is shown wearing what was distinctly a courtly hairstyle at the time. Is that a way of saying they're masquerading as courtly people? Perhaps. This demon seems to be wearing a costume. Even though he has a big nose, you can see that his outfit is sort of a hood, and it almost looks like his horns are part of a costume in some way. Although he's meant to be a demon, presumably he also looks like he's a court jester. Perhaps dressed up to be a demon. The demon, Kolbik is his name, has a beard. So that is sometimes, not always, a Jewish sign. Moses has kind of a 5 o'clock shadow. Does that mean he's trying to hide the fact that he's a Jew? That is also a question mark. They all have quite noticeable protruding eyes. They all have sloping noses. Oh, and I should mention that the demon's name, Kolbik, I believe is a pun. It is a Yiddish and German word. Kolbik means clubby, which actually means big nose. And in fact, Moses Mocha, his nickname in the Latin sources is Moses cum naso, Moses with the nose. So that could mean either that he was known to have a big nose, or that he was known to be nosy. Cum naso was also a Latin phrase for a nosy person. And they are all associated with money in some way. whole book is a devil associated with gold in Slavic, Germanic, and perhaps Yiddish tradition, and they are all shown in the exchequer itself. This is the checkered tablecloth on which the coins were sorted that gives the exchequer its name. This is another figure who generally in the literature has been identified as another Jew. I do not think he's a Jew. I call him our mystery man. Like a Jew, he's associated with the devil demon behind him. Like a Jew, he wears a hood. Like a Jew, he's holding money, in this case scales to weigh the coins, which any functionary of the exchequer would have to do to make sure that they're not being given bad coins, coins that were clipped or that had their edges, their gold content kind of shaved off, which was a crime, a capital crime at this time. He's also frowning, and he also has dark eyebrows and prominent eyes, all as if he were a Jew. But I actually believe that he is probably not a Jew, and I include these two roughly contemporary images, one from Chartres Cathedral, one from another Parisian manuscript, to show that Christian figures, in this case a university student, in this case just a customer of a furrier in a donor stained glass panel, also wear identical hoods. And I argue in the long article I wrote about this cartoon that in fact I believe this figure is a functionary of the Exchequer Bureau, perhaps the very scribe who made the doodle. And another reason I believe that is because of what his fingers are doing. Up here you can see he's holding these scales to weigh the coins, as again an office functionary would have done, but he's holding the scale in a very weird way. I mean, it's actually not physically possible to hold up that heavy a load with just these two fingers. So why would the artist have painted his two fingers that way or drawn his two fingers that way? I think it's in fact to show that this figure, our office functionary, is making a very familiar gesture to medieval people. It's called making the fig. In modern parlance, it's the medieval version of giving the finger. It's a form of crude scatological insult. And in fact, I think our exchequer clerk or scribe is insulting the Jews whom he is caricaturing in his image. And again, I don't want to take up too much time by going through the whole political situation that spurred it. But in a nutshell, my argument about this image is that it is political satire. It's critiquing events that are happening in the spring and summer of 1233, when the king's favorite, who was called a foreigner because he came from the Poitou region of France, was given control of the exchequer of the Jews. He was known to be very close to and to have cooperated with some wealthy Jews, including Isaac of Norwich, who supplied him with, among other things, many hundreds of herring for a feast. And our scribe, I think, is satirizing this connection and alleging that both this royal favorite and the Jews between them were guilty of deceit. The French is tromperie, and that might be why we have trumpets up here. Fraud and usurpation of royal authority. That's why Isaac is shown wearing the king's own crown. And that, in fact, the scribe is accusing, in obviously a very masked sense, veiled sense, of accusing his own boss of bringing the exchequer into disrepute and, in fact, sparking a rebellion that did break out in spring and summer of that year by nobles against the royal favorites. So, those are the ingredients of caricature and political cartoon, taking some true elements, Isaac's cooperation with the royal favorite, Moses' Mauchus' either tendency to be nosy or big nose, their involvement in finance, in order to make a veiled satire of political events. This caricature, we don't know who saw it. Almost certainly only royal scribes and clerks, which might be why Jewish caricature first began to spread in doodles made by royal scribes and clerks, where we see again and again the same kind of imagery, the hooked nose or the sloping nose, a pointed hat or hood, beard or protruding chin, heavily lidded or bulging eyes, and always in association with the themes of corruption or money, power, violence, destruction, or unfortunately, to contradict the always I just said, sometimes these caricatures appear in no context whatsoever, and it shows that maybe drawing this kind of doodle had become such second nature to royal clerks and scribes. They sometimes did that doodle for no discernible reason at all. And I'm afraid probably too quickly, I'm going to go through a few of the doodles on the margins of royal archives that I'm talking about. This one is a man named Aaron of Colchester, who is associated with the devil because the scribe wrote over here. I give the black and white because it's a little easier to read. Aaron fil diable, again in French, Aaron, son of the devil. And it's from a forest roll telling a very interesting court case about a group of kind of raucous poachers who were arrested in the King's Forest in Essex for killing royal deer without permission. And what's so interesting about this group of poachers is it included Jews and non-Jews who seemed to be kind of either a bunch of friends or maybe a criminal gang of some kind that was multicultural or interreligious in some way. But none of the Christians are doodled in caricature in the margin, just Aaron, who was not one of the Jews at all. And perhaps he was there as a spectator, perhaps he knew some of the Jews who were under arrest. We don't really know why Aaron is there, but we know who he was because he was labeled. This is just a scribal doodle in an English account roll next to the section De Judaismo, the receipts collected from the Jews. And you can see here we have the bumped crooked nose and a pointed hood, which, while also worn by non-Jews, was sometimes used of Jews as well. And I can't help mentioning this is from the Cecil Roth collection up at the University of Leeds, again, one of the past presidents of the society. This is actually in the margin of a chronicle written kind of year by year in the Priory of Rochester Cathedral, and under their description of a law passed in the year 1275 known as the Statute of Jewry, which forbade Jews from lending money at interest, he drew his little doodle of a Jew. This time the face is not particularly caricatured, but he was given a hood and a beard, and most notably the tablets of the law to identify him as a Jew. And I think what this shows is not necessarily that the scribe was trying to be intensely anti-Jewish, but that by this period, there was such a deeply ingrained visual image associated with the word Jew or the idea of Jews in a certain kind of scribal culture that this sort of doodle became second nature. This is the same chronicle, margin at the bottom of the page, where the chronicler notes that the King of England in 1290, Edward I, ordered that all Jews be expelled from England. And again, we have three Jews here, not with particularly grotesque facial features, but with the hoods, with the beards, and with the tablets of the law. And it's worth noting that the man who is subjecting them to the threat of violence, at least, and of course expulsion is a form of violence on its own, is dressed like a jester. He looked a little bit like Kolbik the demon, and very much like one of the figures in the margin of this particular document right here. This is just a copy of a grammatical treatise. And it's very interesting to see that there's nothing to do with Jews in this grammatical treatise. Christian was an ancient Roman. He doesn't talk about Jews at all. It's almost impossible to know why the scribe put these Jews here. I can only speculate again, as I said before, that it was just almost second nature for scribes to doodle profiles, and that I haven't quantified it, but maybe 8 times out of 10, those profiles ended up morphing into Jews in some way. I think the scribe started drawing a very typical scribal doodle, which is just a pointing hand showing, hey, pay attention here. And he's pointing at a sentence that says, I am now going to put in rubrics telling you what all of the chapters are about. And I think he's saying, oh yeah, this is an important little thing to notice. And then he got bored and he added this sort of jester-like profile, but again with the beard and the particular pointed beard that suggested maybe Jew. And here even more likely to be a Jew because of the beard and the pointed hat. Again, for no reason except it became habit. Again, a conflation of jester-like clothing and distortions with anti-Jewish imagery, and most notably, of course, the Jewish nose. But this is clearly a very anti-Jewish image. It comes from a manuscript in the British Library that contains a long legendary narrative that tells the alleged kidnapping, crucifixion, and ritual murdering of a young boy known as Adam of Bristol. So this is a murderous Jew who has strung the boy Adam up on a cross and is now stabbing him in mockery of the crucifixion. So obviously about as anti-Semitic a caricature as you can get, but you can see how it built on previous images that were not created necessarily in an anti-Semitic context, and how easily it is for the meanings to grow in a layered way until they accrue very, very anti-Semitic emotions and connotations, even if they didn't start that way. Okay, before I move on into a more recent period, of course, I have to note the additional element that came to permeate anti-Jewish imagery and Jewish caricature, which is the blood libel. The previous image I showed you, the murder of Adam of Bristol, is what we call the ritual murder libel. Again, the Jews allegedly kidnapped, crucified, tortured, and then murdered Christian children. But until the middle of the 13th century, they were said to have done so only in mockery of the crucifixion. At some point in the 13th century, another element is added, the blood libel, which says that Jews were doing these horrible deeds not only in ritual imitation of the crucifixion of Jesus, but because they needed to drink the blood of Christians for health reasons or for ritual reasons of some kind. And this is the most famous image of the most famous of all of the blood libels, the alleged ritual murder and drinking of the blood of a boy known as Little Simon of Trent. The alleged murder happened in the year 1475. This image is from a much repeated print in a chronicle that dates to 1493. And you can see here the blood is pouring out of the circumcised Simon of Trent into a bowl. And I should note that goblets or chalices or bowls of blood are a final, frequently repeated feature of Jewish caricature and political cartoons. So moving forward, obviously skipping a few centuries into the 18th century. This is really the first century since the end of the Middle Ages, when we start to see anti-Jewish imagery, now of course entirely in the absence of real Jews, who again had been expelled from England. By the 18th century, I should mention, they had been readmitted to England. They were readmitted in the 17th century, and I think I have one 17th century image I'll be showing you, but this imagery came into its own in the 18th century. The most frequent themes we see in this imagery are secrecy, Jews having to hide all of their bad characteristics and sometimes even trying to hide their identity, corruption, deceit, and power. The imagery is the familiar one, a devil, hooked nose, thick lips, bulging eyes. And what other contexts? We see anxiety over royal favorites, anxiety over secret deals done by figures in the government, and anxiety over financial corruption. The first one here is from 1769. And it is the target of the caricature is a man known as First Baron Holland, whose family name was Henry Fox. He was the king's favorite, and he's shown with the head of a fox. This is him right here. He has nothing to do with Jews whatsoever, but how does a caricaturist get across the idea in a one square political cartoon that this man is a conspirator, that he is deceitful, that he is dishonest when it comes to money, that he is guilty of embezzlement? Well, you associate him with the devil, and you give the devil the familiar features of the Jews, the horns, the hooked nose, the full lips, the jutting chin, and of course the whole association with the devil in some way. And again, note that the target is not Jews. The target is Henry Fox, but emotions against Henry Fox are mobilized by using anti-Jewish imagery, which taps into loathing, into hatred, into fear, into distrust, which are then transferred onto this noble figure. Here's another one, dates to the year 1770, and it's indicting really the entire royal council, which the cartoonist is alleging had been taken over by the king's favorites, none of whom are to be trusted, and all of whom are secretly plotting. And again, they have to be shown to be more or less recognizable from their hairstyles, or perhaps from a few facial features, but in order to make it clear that they are deceitful, that they are plotting, that they are evil, that they are greedy, they are shown with a devil who looks like a caricatured Jew. And again, the nose, the lips, the chin, the horn, etc. And again, the point is to both make an accusation with certain concrete elements to it and to mobilize fear, loathing, contempt, distaste that's associated with Jews. Anti-Jewish imagery came into its own, unfortunately, in England in the 19th century. The themes tend to be the same: money, greed, corruption, deceit, power, foreignness. The imagery is all the same. The context: financial scandals of the 19th century, of which there were several, most especially very much increased immigration from Eastern Europe. And this is associated with Jews. This is when Jews began to arrive in significant numbers from Eastern Europe, which accentuated the foreign aspect of the accusations. And with the prime ministership of Benjamin Disraeli, it was long held in literature on Disraeli that most of the criticisms of Disraeli did everything they could to avoid anti-Semitism. But a relatively recent article, whose author I cite with gratitude at the end, argues that in fact there are fairly distinct anti-Disraeli cartoons that enroll anti-Jewish imagery, even if the majority of them did not. So let's take a look at just a few from the 19th century. This is from the museum exhibition of spring 2019, in conjunction with which I spoke. Some of you mentioned that you saw me there, so this cartoon might be familiar to you. Its title is Long Faces in the Money Market, or Comforts for Christmas, and it is satirizing the reactions to a very severe fall in the money market in December of 1825. These are all Gentile investors who are bemoaning the fact that they've lost money in this fall. But this, of course, is the one man who did not lose money in the fall. He is a Jew, identifiable with his hooked nose, the brows, the beard, the Eastern European type kaftan and headgear, carrying a big bag of sovereigns, and again saying in a pseudo Yiddish accent, "Pigot, our peoples have got all the Munich." This is one of the cartoons that I think we probably can identify as not just anti-Disraeli, but enlisting anti-Jewish elements, almost certainly not entirely coincidentally. He is shown as Aladdin, is the way it is identified in the satirical journal Punch. Aladdin adapted, but what is Aladdin really? He's an Eastern peddler who gets involved with a genie or a magician. And here he is trying to peddle a new crown to Queen Victoria in a place of her old one. And this is very much criticizing what was known by Disraeli's opponents as his foreign adventures. On the one hand, this does look like Disraeli, and in all fairness, we should admit that Disraeli himself sort of played up the exoticism of his self-image. He curled his hair, or at least allowed natural curls to be accentuated in how he wore it. He did wear this small goatee type beard. He liked to wear sort of extravagant velvet type dandyish clothing, but he did not walk around as a rule wearing a turban. And here we have symbols associated with necromancy and with Easternness. And this is a very old trope in anti-Jewish illustration, associating the Jews with the Turks and alleging that they're all in kind of a foreign-driven world conspiracy to undermine the West or Britain. So I tend to agree with Kenneth Wohl that this is a cartoon which, if not intentionally anti-Jewish, maybe some of you just think it is enlisting anti-Jewish elements in order to harness deep emotions against Disraeli and his alleged foreign adventures. Here is one that seems much more definitively anti-Jewish. It appeared also in Punch in 1883, and it is addressing what was a bit of a scandal as a Christian clergyman, the Reverend C.D. Ginsburg, accused an antiquities dealer named Moses Shapira of forgery and of deceit. And this is how the cartoonist chose to illustrate the accusation. This is the Reverend Ginsburg. I have not been able to determine to what extent this looks like him. This is Moses Shapira, obviously an absolutely standard anti-Jewish caricature. And I found a photograph of Moses Shapira to show you how very, very exaggerated this is. I mean, what is true? It's true that he dressed like an English gentleman and had a beard, but almost everything else is exaggerated to the point, perhaps, of falseness. Okay, political imagery today. Well, again, with a caveat that I'm not an expert, I should say that I had to become, if not an expert, which I don't claim to be, at least familiar with and a follower of contemporary English political imagery, both because I lived in England recently for 2 separate full years, but also because even before my long residencies in England, I started being contacted by English newspapers to comment on political cartoons, advertisements, and political imagery that various people in England alleged were anti-Jewish. And it's become kind of very common for them to run political imagery by me to get my opinion on the matter. So while, again, I do not claim to have an exhausted knowledge of everything that's out there, I have seen a very large percentage of what is proposed or actually published. So I have a little bit of good news, which is my sense from having had many, 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 many cartoons sent to me for my opinion. My sense is that anti-Jewish imagery is not a major theme in mainstream print culture or political culture in the UK today. However, of course, it does appear. These are the contexts in which it appears. Anti-globalism. Just to make it clear that I'm not trying to give a political polemic here, I should say that it appears in anti-globalist imagery, both from the political right, which criticizes globalism, especially from the point of view of immigration, and the political left, which criticizes globalism from the point of view of the economy. It comes into the context, not surprisingly, of the Israel-Palestine conflict. That tends to be mostly from the political left, but not exclusively. It comes into the context of debates over excesses of capitalism or downright critiques of capitalism, most of which come from the political left. And it comes in the context of critiques of socialism, which comes mostly from the political right. So in other words, anti-Jewish imagery is really an all-purpose reservoir of emotion that all dimensions of the political spectrum draw on. Here is really the first cartoon, or in this case, political ad that was ever sent to me for my opinion. It might be familiar to some of you. It comes from January 25th. It was actually emailed to various voters by the Labour Party from a campaign poster. And it shows Michael Howard sort of mesmerizing the country into believing that he can spend the same money twice. There was a fairly lively debate. Is this anti-Jewish? Most people pointed out this is a photograph of Michael Howard. It's not a caricature. It's not distorted in any way. I would respond to that first of all, even photographs can be caricatures if they are shadowed in a way to accentuate certain qualities, if the facial expression is chosen in order to accentuate certain qualities or evoke certain emotions, and that often it's a judgment call whether this has an anti-Jewish effect. And I should say now here, I'm not really talking a lot about intentions. I don't speak to the intentions of contemporary political operatives or political cartoonists. I can't know what's in their heads. But I can speak to effects, and I can speak to the tradition that they are evoking for sure. And I'm afraid there are aspects of this cartoon that trouble me because they draw on long-standing anti-Jewish tropes. One is simply the appearance of a watch on a chain. And I call your attention to this article published by G.K. Chesterton in the year 1917, where in order to criticize newspaper millionaires, he compared them to the second worst thing he could think of, a Jew with a gold watch chain groveling on the floor of the tube. In this case, the Jew with the gold watch chain was probably, I mean, the implication is the Jew was trying to peddle the gold watch chain. And I think further, maybe an implication is that a poor Jewish peddler with a gold watch chain may have gotten the gold watch chain dishonestly, that he might be a thief or a fence or a pawn of some kind. But that's not the only disturbing aspect of this image. There is also the whole implication that Howard is mesmerizing the public or hypnotizing the public, a kind of Svengali. And in fact, there's a long history of hypnotists being depicted in or associated with anti-Jewish imagery or tropes, because the character of Svengali, after whom many hypnotists are named, in the original novel of 1894 is described in this way. He flashed his bold, black, beady Jew eyes into hers, and she straightway mentally prostrated herself. Svengali was a Jew. Hypnotism is associated with Jews in a very negative way. And again, here's the G.K. Chesterton quote underscoring that association. Here's a second one of Michael Howard from the same year, April 2005. This was done by the cartoonist Steve Bell in The Guardian. Are you drinking what we're drinking? Vote conservative. And what are we drinking? We are drinking, if you looked only here, you might think wine, meaning are you getting drunk? But if you look here, obviously you see fangs and the blood running from his mouth. So what this man is drinking is blood. This is disturbing, obviously, on two counts. One is this echo of the blood libel. I would imagine that Steve Bell might say, oh, I had no intention of evoking the blood libel. The blood libel is all about religion, and this is not about religion. The fangs are definitely meant to invoke a vampire. Is that a neutral figure? Well, unfortunately, I think there is reason to believe those historians who have argued that, in fact, vampires are also very closely associated with anti-Judaism. Let me show you why I say that. Because the author of Dracula, if not the inventor of the legend of vampires, but the inventor of the most famous of all vampires, wrote this description of Shylock after he had seen a portrayal of Shylock by the actor Henry Irving. The lips thickened, with the red of the lower lip curling out and over after the manner of the typical Hebraic countenance. The bridge of his nose rose into the Jewish aquiline. The eyes became veiled and glassy with introspection, eyes which at times could and did flash like lurid fire. In other words, Bram Stoker knew perfectly well what an anti-Jewish caricature looked like. And here's how he describes Dracula when he goes on to write the novel Dracula. His face was a very strong aquiline, the high bridge of the thin nose and particularly arched nostrils. And here I'm just skipping to the more clearly anti-Jewish part. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy mustache, was fixed and rather cruel looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. So I think I should say, I can conclude that associating Michael Howard with a vampire evokes long-standing anti-Jewish tropes, visual and textual, and that it would definitely elicit anti-Jewish feelings and ideas, whether or not Steve Bell knew it. And I will further add that if he didn't know it, he should have known it. And I think he probably did, because cartoonists tend to study art history, and this is now a well-known history in art. Okay, to move on to my penultimate image, some of you might be wondering about the notorious mural that was painted on a wall in East London in 2012, and I will just say, yes, in my estimation, again, intentional or not, this image was anti-Jewish in that its anti-capitalist message invokes everything we've seen before. The nose, I should add, the eyeglasses, spectacles were a more modern way of alleging that Jews were weak-sighted and blind to the truth. We have over here, again, weak eyes, a hooked nose, the beard, the association with money, the use of kind of hidden conspiratorial power to crush and oppress, the implication that it was a foreign international conspiracy. This is the Statue of Liberty. This is the Eiffel Tower. So yes, I think those people who were upset at this mural and upset with Jeremy Corbyn's retweeting of the mural, although I should note that he subsequently apologized and said he had not noticed the anti-Jewish elements, this definitely drew on anti-Jewish imagery in a way that has to be construed as eliciting anti-Jewish feelings. Okay, now I promised or threatened Brexit, and this is where I want to talk about the transference of Jewish imagery to specific other groups. I mean, we've seen it transferred to royal favorites, we've seen it transferred to international capitalists, but also to other specific groups. So this is an anti-Brexit cartoon that appeared in the Daily Mail under a regular feature called Mac On, the cartoonist being somebody who identifies himself as Mac, from November 2015. It's called Europe's Open Borders, and you can see here this says, "Welcome to Europe, our open borders and the free movement of people." And here are the people and non-people who are pouring into Europe, with the implication, of course, that they will therefore pour from Europe into England, into the UK, if Brexit doesn't happen, are a figure with a bulbous nose and a hat, a figure with a bulbous nose and a hat, and here eyeglasses, a figure with a fat belly, and rats. So I was asked to consult on this specifically because of the rats and the long association, especially, though by no means exclusively, in Nazi anti-Jewish caricature and cartoons. And I will say, yes, rats are associated with Jews in Nazi cartoons. Rats might not be definitive because the rats are used for a lot of other things too. So let me just highlight a few other features that are much more tightly associated with Jews than rats alone. One here we can see from this figure. He's wearing, this almost looks like a turban. We also see eyeglasses, the bulging nose, the beard, and as we've seen before, the turban is used in anti-Jewish imagery imagery, and this is a figure definitely identifiable as a Jew in a late medieval depiction of Christ carrying the cross. This is the Jew watching the crucifixion with typical shifty, deceitful, negative Jewish scowl on his face. We have here the spectacles, as I mentioned, an anti-Jewish image showing the Jews' blindness. This is from a late medieval depiction of the circumcision of Jesus, which, although according to the Gospel of Mark, was voluntarily entered into by Jesus's parents, Joseph and Mary, by the year 1460, when this was painted, was almost seen as a kind of a prototype for ritual murder and Jews torturing Christian children. This figure is also wearing not a turban, but a sort of military cap, a weird military cap, which only people, I think, well-versed in 20th century political cartoons will recognize. It's a Soviet cap. And this depiction of a Jew, we know from the Star of David right here, as well as from the nose, the teeth, etc., is from a Soviet cartoon which proclaimed that the Jew was the ruler of the Bolsheviks. And here is, of course, a Jewish Bolshevik soldier kind of clutching the CCCP, that's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in Russian lettering. He is the power behind the Leninistic throne, according to Nazi propaganda. What about this figure? This is very odd. Just a big belly. We never see this figure's head, wearing weird old-fashioned breeches. And it's the check pattern, the heavy belly, the suitcase or briefcase that this man is carrying, but especially the fact that these breeches kind of hark back to 1930s movie clothing style that led me to this particular image. Another Nazi anti-Jewish illustration, this time not from a political cartoon, but from a distinctly uncharming children's picture book called Trust No Fox in the Green Meadow and No Jew on His Oath. And this is how the Nazis portrayed Jewish, destructive, conniving, deceitful, conspiratorial bankers and international capitalists with these old-fashioned breeches, old-fashioned already at the time this was made, kind of to show that they are outdated and rooted in the past, usually with a briefcase and the fat belly, and of course the Jewish caricatured face. So I would conclude, intentional or not, and I believe Max studied at art school and knew a lot of this visual history, so I think he would be hard-pressed to argue complete ignorance, that this image does draw on long-standing anti-Jewish caricature, tropes, symbols, ideas, in order to tar, well, whom? Immigrants to Europe who were threatening Britain. And you all know better than I do who these people were, although I was living in England at the time and I know what the newspapers were saying. People were worried about Poles, people were worried about Romanians, and people were worried, of course, about Syrians and sometimes about Turks, none of whom were Jewish. So this again represents the transference of anti-Jewish kind of reflexively triggered feelings, hatreds, distrust, fear onto non-Jewish figures, in part because those are such useful and deeply ingrained images, in part because some of these figures, Poles and Romanians, had no readily recognizable imagery on which political cartoonists could draw. So they were forced to go back to the more familiar arsenal. And the result, of course, whatever the intention, is deeply destructive. So that I would argue that using all of these symbols I've shown you associated with Jews evokes the qualities that Jews were alleged to embody, and I'm just summarizing here everything I've said already: corruption, greed, fraud, deceit, foreignness, conspiracy, power, parasitism, harm. These symbols and conceptual links in turn provide a conceptual link to other individuals or groups labeled elitist. I'm thinking of the 2012 mural on the wall: capitalist, urban, globalist, deceitful, parasitical, harmful, etc. They immobilize the emotions long aroused by this anti-Jewish imagery, and they mobilize the almost uniquely visceral impact of visual imagery. We react to pictures much more powerfully than we react to visual imagery in order to create a kind of subtle, unstated guilt through similarity and or guilt by association. And my final argument is, although it's fair enough to ask what the artists intended, it doesn't even really matter that much in the end, because intention does not control reception interpretation. If a cartoonist wants to draw a political cartoon that is not anti-Jewish, she or he has to not just think about what they intend, but study the history of the images and symbols they're going to use, and avoid anything that might spark anti-Judaism. The responsibility is theirs, and I would add, the reason I, as a medievalist, am venturing into the 21st century is because I think the responsibility is also ours, we scholars who study this, to keep on trying to educate the public as to what they are looking at and what it might mean. And I will simply end with a thank you so much to this venerable society, to Miri Rubin, my friend, my colleague, and my hero, for the invitation, to Stuart Brooks, who supplied me with those Hebrew manuscript illuminations, as I mentioned. And here are the names of only a few of the many scholars whose work I consulted for this talk.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And what I take away, and I think others will as well, is just how much you learn when you just take this forensic, careful, judicious approach, and how rare it is in our news cycles and our political life for people who opine to have the patience, not to do the research themselves, but even just to read properly. And I think all this work that you're doing in writing in various genre and blogs and so on can only help. And each and one of us as well, you know, can go out and just spread these insights, even in conversations, let alone in teaching. So I'm really grateful to you. This was, this was a masterclass. And we have some time for questions. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, or please read in the box. I'm gonna put, oops, sorry, I've just lost you all. Where are you? Oops.
And let me say, while Miri is looking, that I am doing my best to scroll through your comments, and I'm cutting and pasting your recommendations, some of which I'm not familiar with, and for which I thank you all, a very learned audience, obviously.
Sorry, I am lost. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm somehow lost my connection. I literally cannot see you. I'm going to try and find you, but you can hear me. So,
Yes.
Sarah, could you look down for a moment and find your questions until I can find my route back to you?
Yes, I am scrolling through. One question from my friend Manuel Lerdau from the University of Virginia, who is the most literate scientist. No, I have to say tied for the most literate scientist I know. What was the point of making anti-Jewish art in England after the Jews had been expelled from England? Maybe you typed that out before I finished the talk. And I tried to say, when I was talking about the 18th century imagery and the 21st century imagery, that the visceral emotional reaction to a lot of this anti-Jewish imagery had become so much second nature, so deeply ingrained into the culture, and so much a part of the reaction to seeing that kind of symbolism, that it became a useful way of arousing such emotions, of arousing loathing, of arousing fear, of arousing suspicion or distaste in some way. So even if you're not explicitly saying, for example, that Henry Fox was in cahoots with Jewish financiers, by using a very Jewish-looking devil when you're talking about Henry Fox, you're automatically making your audience think, oh, he's a shifty, you know what. So it's really because of the emotional, visceral impact and this subconscious chain of associations that it elicits. I hope that helps answer that question. Another question that I see here, and I'm sorry if I am missing some.
I'm back to, I was wanting to ask Jeffrey Olderman if he'd like to say a bit more about this very interesting comment he made in the chat box.
Oh, can you read the comment first? Because I'm going back and forth. Yeah.
Jeffrey, you'll explain actually, if you don't mind.
Hi, hello.
Hi, good to see you.
Shall I speak?
Yes, indeed. Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yes, it's absolutely fascinating presentation for which I add my own thanks and congratulations to Sarah. I simply put a comment in there about Dracula because a recent authoritative biography of Bram Stoker, and I give the precise page reference there, suggests that Bram Stoker was actually modelled on the 19th century swashbuckling hero and sex maniac, Sir Richard Burton, who wrote a celebrated manuscript, which I happen to have read from first page to last, called Human Sacrifice Amongst the Sephardim or Eastern Jews. Burton was the translator of the Arabian Nights and the Kama Sutra into English, a very controversial figure, but a true Victorian swashbuckling hero. And you have only to read the description of Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel and look at photographs, of which there aren't many, of Burton to see these similarities. And this suggests to me that maybe sometimes, just sometimes, we're looking for anti-Jewish prejudice in caricatures where none actually exists. But Miri, I don't want anyone on this fascinating event to think that I'm being controversial. So I'll stop at that point. But can I add a footnote? I'm absolutely devastated to hear about Ada Rappaport Albert. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. But it sounds to me that that last comment before you mentioned Ada actually fits in with some of the sentiments that Sarah was trying to convey as well. And Sarah, it might be just really good, particularly with Jeffrey's comment in mind, maybe just to restate what you mean by that.
Yes, absolutely. It is possible to have visual elements that are reminiscent of anti-Jewish caricature, or maybe that are reminiscent of specific people, without any anti-Jewish intent at all. There's no question but that many people draw Dracula as he's described, portray Shylock as they imagine he would have looked, without having the slightest intent of denigrating Jews at all. But kind of my last warning is intent cannot control reception or reading. There's something, obviously in literary theory, which people who work on art and imagery, such as myself, have very much taken to heart. It's called reception theory. And reception theory says you have to sort of consider the horizon of expectations that will govern how people react to either a text or an image and how they understand it. And you have to ask yourself what kind of elements in the landscape of the horizon of expectations existed and give scope for a range of reactions. So of course, many people can read Dracula and not once think, he was a blood-sucking Jew. But people who are familiar with anti-Jewish imagery. And there would have been many, many people by 1894, and obviously in the decades ever since, who are familiar with anti-Jewish imagery, who would find it hard to read about an aquiline nose and about blood sucking, and about the fangs and the ruby red lips, without thinking, wow, that sounds like a Jew. So I'm not saying you're not allowed to draw a vampire, but you have to be very conscious of the possible readings. And there are ways of counteracting anti-Semitic readings. So that, for example, one of, to my mind, the most, to me, it was really kind of unfortunate and almost painful conversation I had was with the absolutely brilliant graphic artist Art Spiegelman, whose work I revere. He made the graphic novel Mouse about the Holocaust. And he weighed in about a notorious magazine cover during the 2008 American presidential campaign that showed then candidate Barack Obama and his wife Michelle Obama making a sign of Black Power and carrying a machine gun. And there was a big outcry, and people said, that's racist, that's horrible. And I happened to meet Spiegelman shortly after this whole outbreak, and he was very defensive of that cover. He didn't draw it himself, but he was defensive on behalf of the artist, and he said, that's ridiculous. Anybody looking at that cover would know that the artist is making fun of right-wing people who call Michelle Obama a terrorist. And I said to him, anybody would know that who is capable of reading the mind of the artist, or who has an intimate familiarity with the editorial position of the New Yorker, perhaps. But the image itself, devoid of context, which is how it went viral around the internet, does not have any visual cues to show that the artist is distancing himself from the portrayal of Michelle Obama as a Black Power terrorist. If he had put it in a thought bubble, if he had sort of shown a little figure on the right looking at Michelle Obama that way, those would have been visual ways to clearly signify that the artist was not intending to endorse that image. But again, there was no visual cue in the image. And so I thought that although I wasn't blaming the artist, I was not accusing the artist of racism, I was saying that he wasn't careful enough in thinking he could control the reading of the image just because it appeared on the cover of the New Yorker.
But of course, there we have the problem of not only of the social media, that is, you may want to make an ironic gesture in the New Yorker, but there are no boundaries to where things are going to travel. But also, I think the sort of there's also a sort of intergenerational thing in terms of it's the younger people who are consuming it fastest and without all those layers, as it were, of cultural reference. So, I mean, the responsibility upon anyone producing anything is absolutely enormous right now. I see that David Newman has a collection, a large collection of caricatures about people crossing borders, which he uses in teaching. And as we're all thinking about how to be better teachers, particularly in the wake of what's happened in the last few weeks, I wonder if you want to come in. Are you still with us? David Newman.
I'm still with you. I'm still with you. No, it's just that this was just a by comment because, you know, I live in two different research worlds, Anglo-Jewish history and my real world of geopolitics and borders. I've been collecting border caricatures for many years. I have over 400 of them at the moment. And I've actually given poster sessions about how based on caricatures. And I always show them at some of my presentations, but I'm not really a professional in knowing how to analyze the use of caricatures. There's no question that caricatures in any area of work research, whether it be history or contemporary politics, is a very important insight into how people think about the particular features. And often the best caricatures are in those countries which don't have the best systems of democracy. And that's the way you can really express what you want to say without getting immediately thrown into prison or something. But no, I just made the comment here, but okay, it's a very different type and use of caricature. But if anyone out there has some tips for me about how you can take large collections of caricatures and really analyze their content, I would be very happy and interested to know. And if there are people out there who are interested in seeing caricatures of borders, send me an email. I'll send you a whole load of them. And if any of you have interesting ones, please send me them. The problem, by the way, is always the copyright issue, because you're always stealing them from someone else.
Miri, if I can step in a little bit. Can you hear me, David?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. So what I can do is I can tell you the way I went about analyzing my body of images. It was a matter of great frustration to me, and maybe some wry teasing on the part of my dearest friends, that in fact it took me something like 9 years to write my second book, because I had, what did you say, you have 400 cartoons?
I collect them all the time, yeah.
Yeah, I think I had roughly 4,000 images in my corpus of images for my book, and I had to figure out a way of analyzing them and really quantifying them and figuring out, you know, what are the important anti-Jewish symbols, or maybe Jewish symbols, and then figuring out which ones are anti-Jewish as opposed to just sort of neutral identifying Jewish. So what I did, which you might not want to do because I gather you have a day job that is very demanding, was I created a database of each discrete element as I identified it, the visual elements, and if there's text, the textual elements. So, you know, the hat, the nose, the beard, the suitcase, the rat, the this, the that, and I created a database, and then I figured out in which cartoons, or in my case, you know, medieval images, and in how many medieval images all of those things appeared, and then I would sort of group them and look at the groups separately to see how they worked and how they evolved. And, you know, many of the items I fit into my database did not make it into my book, because I concluded they were either not quantitatively significant enough or qualitatively meaningful enough to actually make a difference in the story that I was trying to decipher. The ones that made it into the book are the ones that had a critical mass in terms of quantity and a critical import in terms of meaning.
Okay. You can imagine there's certain themes which are strong at different times, such as Trump and the wall between the USA and Mexico. It's a big theme. Or Israel's separation barrier. Or you have a whole load of caricatures today showing walls preventing contemporary Mayflower pilgrims coming into North America. You know, there's certain themes over time which come back.
Yeah, I'm sure. I would be very interested. Do you have that on a website anywhere, your collection?
I've got. Let's correspond. I can send you some, and I can show you.
I would love that.
Some videos of lectures where I've used them. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd be very interested in that. Could I just mention that I see a question, or to my mind, it's more of a very helpful, important comment from Michael Berkson. You referred to short processing time of the image. What about Gilray or Hogarth? Yes, you're absolutely right. I had to skip very quickly over intervening centuries. What is my defense for not including Hogarth? I couldn't include everything, and I think Hogarth has been very well studied, and there are excellent books on Hogarth political imagery, and the same with Gilray. So all I can say is thank you so much for adding those names, and of course there could be many more into the conversation. I could also send anybody who maybe via Miri or directly to my Stony Brook email would like a bibliography on this. Besides the names I included in my thank you, the last slide of my presentation, there is, of course, quite a long and growing bibliography on this issue. When I first started working on the visual depiction of Jews in 1980 something, there was a very short bibliography. It is now vast and ever growing and very high quality, I should add.
I should say that sorry, we have a whole lot of interesting comments here. We'll make available to you because the recording will be available, and I think then this also produces that. But Sarah, I just wanted to say that 2 days ago, I listened into a lecture by David Rich. He was presenting at Indiana University, I think. Maybe they have a Center for Anti-Semitism. He gave an extremely lucid and extremely cogent presentation about anti-Semitism as it manifests itself during the COVID crisis. Now, this is really, really, really the fringe right, which you correctly said, most of the mainstream doesn't come close to it.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure whether the term caricature is quite right, because the technique is caricature, but it's actually for people within a group of believers and adherents that is seriously far right. I mean, he said that, well, I mean, some of the stuff he couldn't actually even show a group of experts. It was so odious. So again, as some people have just suggested, this issue of new topics being dealt with, the COVID, the pandemic, and who's making money out of it and so on, with those old tropes, and that was so powerful about it. So I think there's
if I could if I could just add, you know, because this is for the Jewish Historical Society of England, I concentrated on English material in this, but obviously if I had used North American material, I could have talked for another year and a half. But I can't help but say, in the context of what you just mentioned, sort of the repurposing of a lot of this, or the resurfacing of these heinous ideas. And this is in relation to what was it David Jacobs just told us about his immigration cartoons, that the horrendous Tree of Life synagogue shooting was done by somebody who was primary hatreds were against Mexican immigrants, but he believed this, you know, completely diseased underground claim that Jewish charitable agencies were secretly funding caravans of Mexicans coming into America, and that is why he attacked a synagogue in Pittsburgh. I mean, a truly feverish, I won't say disease because that's letting these people too much off the hook, but pathological importation, mobilization of anti-Semitism in what would seem to be a completely random context. With, I should say, a paradoxical result, which is that Jews across America started pouring money into refugee aid services and immigration aid groups in solidarity.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's getting late here, and it's definitely late in Jerusalem already. It's so kind of you to join us. I know how busy you are and how much in demand, so we're very, very grateful. I've really, really enjoyed the questions and the level of engagement, and there are lots of big thank yous on the side that you will see as well. And I hope that people will feel free to write to Sarah with suggestions, with afterthoughts, because these conversations are current, and although they started in the 13th century with that image from the 13th century, as you see, Sarah is very engaged in what's happening around us. I also want to thank very much Caroline Morris, who's the chair of the Jewish Historical Society of England, and who has made this whole thing possible, and working behind the scenes, even as Sarah was speaking, sorting out various problems while listening in. And so it takes that sort of collaboration, and thank you all for joining. Our next meeting will be in a fortnight, and a member of our new generation group, Joe Cronin, will be speaking, and we're just so delighted to see so many of you joining us on these evenings and learning together. So thank you again, Sara Lipton, and
thank you.
I'm gonna say, you know, I'm just going to clap in as much as I can. But as you will see, that a lot of people are, and I know that they mean it. Okay. Bye, everybody. Join us again.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
If you aren't members already. Great to see you, Jeffrey.
Bye.
Thank you very much for your contribution.
Yeah, so it'd be nice to call her up and wish her happy birthday.
Yeah, and
You get your brothers together, yes.
hello, Gareth. I can finally see you.